There are moments in a courtroom that you never forget, not because of the legal arguments, not because of the evidence, but because of what a person reveals about themselves when they believe the rules simply do not apply to them. This is one of those moments. What you're about to hear is the story of a man who spent years building a reputation as untouchable, a man who confused public office with personal ownership, a man who walked into one of the most recognizable courtrooms in America with the posture of someone arriving at their own party. He did not leave the same way. By the time this was over, the city that once celebrated him would be watching his name disappear from every building it had been placed on. And the woman sitting behind that bench, the one he clearly underestimated, would have delivered a verdict that the entire country talked about for weeks. But before we get to what happened inside that courtroom, you need to understand who this man was. Because the ending only makes sense when you understand the beginning. Mayor Gerald Thorne had been in office for 11 years. In a mid-sized American city with a complicated history and a population that had learned to accept mediocrity from its leadership, 11 years is a long time. Long enough to become furniture, long enough to stop being questioned, long enough to start believing that your position is permanent and that the people beneath you exist to serve your comfort. Thorne had not always been this way. People who knew him early in his career described a different man, driven, community-focused, someone who genuinely seemed to care about the city's struggling neighborhoods, its failing schools, its aging infrastructure. He had come from a working-class family. His father had been a union electrician. His mother had worked 2 jobs most of her adult life. He used to talk about that, used to reference it in speeches, used to let it humanize him. But 11 years of unchecked power has a way of erasing a person's origin story. By the time the court case that would define his legacy was filed, Gerald Thorne had become something his younger self would not have recognized. He traveled with a private security detail paid for by city funds. He had relocated the mayor's official vehicle, a black SUV originally designated for city use, to his personal residence full-time. He had approved rezoning permits for a commercial development project that, as it turned out, his brother-in-law had a controlling stake in. These were not rumors. These were documented. They had been reported, twice. Once by a local investigative journalist who later found her press credentials mysteriously revoked. Once by a city council member who subsequently found himself the subject of a tax audit. The city knew. The people knew. And Gerald Thorne knew that they knew, and he continued anyway, because in his mind, knowing and doing something about it were 2 entirely different things. He had been right about that, until he wasn't. The case that brought Mayor Thorne before Judge Judy was not the criminal investigation. That would come later. The case that triggered everything was, on the surface, a civil dispute. A woman named Patricia Carver had filed a complaint against the city, and specifically against the mayor's office, for wrongful termination and retaliation. Patricia had worked for the city's Department of Public Works for 19 years. She was not a flashy person. She was not an activist. She was a civil servant who showed up, did her job, and kept her head down. She managed procurement records, which meant she tracked how city money was being spent on contracts, supplies, and services. And over the course of about 14 months, she had noticed something wrong. Invoices that didn't match contracts, payments made to vendors who had no verifiable address, line items for equipment that the department had never received, small enough individually to be dismissed as clerical errors, large enough in aggregate to represent something far more deliberate. Patricia had done what any responsible civil servant would do. She documented what she found. She created a paper trail. She filed an internal report with the city's compliance office. 2 weeks later, she was called into a meeting with her direct supervisor and a representative from the mayor's office. She was told that her position had been restructured, that her role no longer existed, that she would receive a standard severance package, and that her access to city systems had already been deactivated. 19 years. Gone in a 2-paragraph letter. Patricia hired an attorney. The attorney filed a wrongful termination claim. And because the city's legal team, also funded by taxpayer money, had been slow and dismissive in responding to discovery requests, the case had escalated to a venue that the mayor's office had not anticipated. Judge Judy's courtroom. Now, you have to understand something about how Gerald Thorne operated. He did not take anything seriously that he could not control, and he had spent so long controlling everything around him that he had genuinely lost the ability to perceive a threat until it was directly in front of his face. His team had advised him not to appear personally. His city attorney had told him clearly and firmly that his presence was unnecessary and potentially counterproductive. A deputy could represent the city. The case could be handled quietly, settled even. Thorne had overruled them all. He had decided to appear himself because, in his own words, he was not going to let some city clerk drag his name through the mud in front of a television audience. He was going to show up, straighten this out, and demonstrate to everyone watching that he was a mayor who took accountability seriously. The irony of that statement would become clearer as the morning progressed. He arrived at the courthouse with 2 members of his security team, a personal assistant, and a media advisor. He was dressed impeccably. Charcoal suit, silk tie, American flag pin on the lapel. He had clearly prepared for optics, not for testimony. The people who witnessed his arrival in the hallway outside the courtroom described the same thing. He walked like a man who expected the room to adjust to him. He didn't look at anyone directly. He moved through the space as if it were an inconvenience he was graciously tolerating. When someone from the production staff explained to his assistant that the security team could not enter the courtroom with him, Thorne himself responded, loudly enough for several people to hear. "Do you know who I am?" Not a question, a declaration. The staff member, professionally and without hesitation, said, "You're one of the parties in today's case, sir. Please follow me." Thorne's jaw tightened. He straightened his tie. He followed. Patricia Carver was already inside. She sat at the plaintiff's table in a navy blazer, her hands folded in front of her, her expression composed. She had been waiting for this for nearly 2 years. Her savings had been largely depleted by legal fees. She had taken a part-time accounting job to keep her household running. She was 53 years old, and she looked like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and had simply decided to keep carrying it because putting it down was not an option. Her attorney had prepared her thoroughly, but Patricia didn't need much preparation. She had the documents. She had always had the documents. She was, after all, a woman who kept records for a living. When Mayor Thorne entered the courtroom and took his place at the defendant's table, Patricia did not look at him. She kept her eyes forward. Her attorney leaned over and said something quietly to her. She nodded once. Thorne, by contrast, scanned the room. He made eye contact with the camera. He straightened his posture in a way that suggested he was performing for an audience rather than preparing for a legal proceeding. Then Judge Judy entered. If you have never watched Judge Judy Scheindlin work, it is difficult to explain the specific quality of attention she brings to a case. It is not theatricality. It is not aggression. It is something closer to surgical precision combined with a complete absence of deference. She has sat on that bench long enough to recognize every variety of human dishonesty, and she recognizes it not with outrage, but with a kind of calm, almost clinical interest. Like a doctor who has seen the same disease many times and knows exactly what it looks like. She reviewed the case summary. She looked at both parties, and then she began. She asked Thorne to confirm his identity and his role in the city government. He did so with the kind of practiced smoothness of a man accustomed to introductions. "Mayor Gerald Thorne," he said, "serving the people of this city for over a decade." Judge Judy looked up from her papers. "You're not serving anyone right now," she said. "Right now, you're a defendant. Let's keep that straight." The audience murmured. Thorne's smile didn't disappear entirely, but it changed. It became a different kind of smile, the kind people wear when they're recalculating. The early portion of the hearing covered the basic facts of Patricia's employment and termination. Her attorney walked through the timeline. 19 years of service. Positive performance reviews throughout. No disciplinary record. The internal report filed in March. The termination notice delivered in April. The sequence was clean, documented, and damning in its simplicity. Thorne's city attorney attempted to reframe the termination as a budgetary restructuring. Judge Judy let him speak for approximately 90 seconds before she interrupted. Which budget line was restructured? Silence. Which department budget was reduced that necessitated eliminating her specific position? More silence. The attorney shuffled papers. I'm going to need a number, Judge Judy said. A line item, a memo, something that shows this restructuring happened before she filed that internal report. Because if the restructuring happened after, that's not restructuring, that's retaliation. And I suspect you know the difference. The attorney said he would need to locate the relevant documentation. You should have located it before you walked in here, she said. She moved on. This is the part of the story where Mayor Thorne made his first serious error. Up to this point, he had been quiet, controlled, allowing his attorney to handle the proceedings while he maintained the posture of a dignified official who had graciously shown up to resolve a misunderstanding. But when Judge Judy began questioning the timeline of Patricia's termination in relation to her internal compliance report, and when it became increasingly clear that the city attorney was not adequately explaining the gap, Thorne leaned forward and spoke without being asked. Your Honor, if I may. Judge Judy looked at him. No, you may not. Your attorney speaks for you. Sit back. Thorne blinked. He was not accustomed to being interrupted. He was certainly not accustomed to being told to sit down by anyone. There was a visible moment, brief but unmistakable, where his composure slipped, where something harder and more instinctive surfaced behind his eyes. He sat back. But then, approximately 4 minutes later, when Judge Judy was reviewing Patricia's procurement anomaly report and noting the specific dollar amounts Patricia had flagged, Thorne did it again. Those figures are being taken out of context. Judge Judy put her pen down. She did not raise her voice. She did not have to. Mayor Thorne, I have been doing this for a very long time. In this courtroom, people speak when I ask them to speak. That includes mayors. That includes senators. That includes anyone who walks through that door. Are we clear? Thorne opened his mouth. Are we clear? He nodded. Say it. Yes, he said. We're clear. Good. She picked her pen back up. Now let's talk about these invoices. What followed was 22 minutes of some of the most methodical dismantling of a paper trail that anyone in that room had likely ever witnessed. Patricia's attorney introduced the procurement records she had compiled during her time at the department. Judge Judy reviewed them herself, reading aloud specific line items, specific dates, specific vendor names, and then asking the city attorney, point by point, to account for each one. The attorney could not. Not because the information wasn't there, but because the information that was there was deeply incriminating, and any attempt to explain it honestly would have required admitting things that a city attorney is not in a position to admit in a civil proceeding without significant legal consequences. Judge Judy was aware of this dynamic. She had seen it before. She continued asking the questions anyway, because the questions themselves, and the inability to answer them, told the story more clearly than any direct accusation could. Vendors with no verifiable business address, payments processed within 48 hours of invoice submission, bypassing the standard 30-day review period. A pattern that began, Patricia's records showed, approximately 8 months after the rezoning approval for the commercial development project that Thorne's brother-in-law was invested in. Judge Judy set the documents down. She looked at Thorne directly. You're the mayor. These contracts were approved under your administration. Did you review them? I have a large team that handles. Did you personally review these specific contracts? A pause. Not each individual. So your answer is no. My answer is that the appropriate oversight channels. Your answer, Judge Judy said, is no. Let's move forward. Patricia had been sitting quietly through all of this, but when it was her turn to speak, she did not perform. She did not cry. She did not reach for sympathy. She simply told the truth, in the precise and organized way of a woman who had spent 2 decades cataloging facts. She described what she had found. She described what she had reported. She described the meeting where she was told her position no longer existed. She described the moment she walked out of the building where she had worked for 19 years and sat in her car for 40 minutes before she could start the engine. I wasn't even angry at first, she said. I was confused. I thought there must be some mistake. I thought someone would call me. I thought it would be corrected. No one called. And then I thought about what I had reported. And I thought about who was involved. And I understood that this wasn't a mistake. This was a message. Judge Judy looked at her for a long moment. Did anyone from the mayor's office ever contact you after your termination? Patricia shook her head. No. Did anyone from the compliance office follow up on your internal report? No. Has any investigation been opened into the procurement irregularities you documented? Patricia's voice stayed steady. Not that I've been informed of. Judge Judy wrote something down. She underlined it. She set her pen aside. Okay, she said quietly. I've heard enough. What happened next has been described by people who were in that room in varying ways, but there are certain details that everyone agrees on. Judge Judy looked at the documents one final time. She looked at Mayor Thorne, and then she said something that was neither theatrical nor prolonged, but that carried the full weight of everything she had observed over the preceding hour. In 20 years of doing this, I have met a lot of people who thought their title protected them from consequences. It never has, and it doesn't today. She ruled in favor of Patricia Carver. Full damages. Wrongful termination confirmed. Retaliation confirmed. She awarded Patricia the maximum damages applicable under the case parameters, including back pay, legal fees, and compensatory damages for emotional distress. And then she did something that was within her authority, but that no one, including Thorne's own legal team, had anticipated. Based on the procurement documents entered into evidence, she formally referred the case to the appropriate federal oversight authority for investigation of potential public fraud. In plain language, she flagged it, on the record, in front of cameras, with specific reference to the contract irregularities, the vendor anomalies, and the timeline connecting the termination of a whistleblower to the contracts in question. Thorne's media advisor, sitting outside the courtroom, reportedly received a phone call from inside that lasted less than 30 seconds. Then he made 3 calls of his own. Then he sat very still. Thorne did not accept the ruling gracefully. This was perhaps the final and most revealing moment of the entire proceeding. As Judge Judy began wrapping up the session, Thorne stood from his chair without permission and addressed her directly. This is a politically motivated, sit down, Mayor Thorne, attack on a duly elected official, and the people of this city will, bailiff, see through exactly what this is. What happened in the next 15 seconds was not, technically, an arrest. But the intervention of the court officer, the physical redirection, the raised voices, the sudden chaos of a man who had finally, completely, and irreversibly lost control of himself in a room that had been recording everything. That sequence of events was captured on camera and broadcast that evening. And that footage, a mayor, suit disheveled, being physically guided from a courtroom after openly defying a judge's direct order, his face no longer composed, no longer performing, That footage went everywhere. By midnight, it was the most shared clip on every major platform. By the following morning, the city council had convened an emergency session. Within 72 hours, 2 federal investigators had requested access to the procurement records Patricia had submitted as evidence. Within 3 weeks, Gerald Thorne had resigned from office. The official statement cited personal reasons and the desire to spend more time with family. No one believed it. No one was meant to. Patricia Carver received her damages. She did not hold a press conference. She did not appear on television. Her attorney released a brief written statement on her behalf that said, simply, that she was grateful the truth had been heard. She went back to work. Not for the city, for a nonprofit organization that provides legal assistance to public sector employees who face retaliation for internal reporting. She has never spoken publicly about Mayor Thorne directly. When a reporter once asked her what she thought when she saw the footage of him being removed from the courtroom, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I thought about all the people who reported things before me and weren't believed. I hope they saw it too." There is something important to name here, and it is not about Gerald Thorne. It is about what Patricia Carver did before any courtroom, before any camera, before any ruling. She kept records. She filed a report. She did the thing that is supposed to work, even when everything around her suggested it wouldn't. She trusted a system that then betrayed her. And then she trusted it again, through an attorney, through a legal filing, through a 2-year process that cost her financially and emotionally in ways that are difficult to fully account for. And it worked. Not because systems are inherently just, but because someone, sitting behind a bench, asked the right questions and refused to accept non-answers. That combination, a person willing to report and an authority figure willing to listen, is rarer than it should be. When it comes together, it tends to produce exactly this kind of result. Not revenge, not spectacle, justice. Quiet, documented, irrefutable justice. Gerald Thorne's name has been removed from 2 city buildings that had been named in his honor during his tenure. The commercial development project linked to his brother-in-law's investment is currently under a separate civil inquiry. The city's compliance office has been restructured, and a new whistleblower protection policy has been formally adopted. These are not dramatic outcomes. They will not make a satisfying film ending, but they are real, and they are the direct result of one woman who kept her records and one judge who read them carefully. The moment Thorne walked into that courtroom, he was operating on the assumption that the room would adapt to him, that his title would precede his character, that confidence and status would substitute for truth. He was wrong. He had been wrong for a long time. He just hadn't met the right room yet. The thing about people like Gerald Thorne is that they tend to confuse the silence of others with agreement. They mistake the absence of resistance for the absence of awareness. People knew. They had always known. They were simply waiting for a space where speaking carried less risk than staying quiet. Patricia gave them that space, at significant cost to herself. Judge Judy made that space undeniable. And when the moment finally came, it didn't require dramatics. It didn't require outrage. It required documents, questions, and a judge with no interest in being impressed. That is what accountability looks like when it actually works. Not a performance, not a spectacle, a reckoning. Calm, thorough, and permanent. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself thinking about the Patricias in your own world, the people who noticed something wrong, filed a report, and were quietly pushed out, then you already understand why this case matters beyond the courtroom. The powerful do not typically fall because someone confronts them loudly. They fall because someone kept quiet and kept records, long enough, carefully enough, until the truth had nowhere left to hide. And sometimes, on the right day, in the right room, with the right person sitting behind the bench, that is more than enough.